Hi, everybody. This is to review an email I got of somebody claiming that the count of the generations in verse 17 from Abraham to David should include Abraham as the father, as we can see here in this actual verse. So if you count Abraham to Isaac as one generation, then you end up with only 13 generations when you get up to Jesse begat David. So then once you get to David, then you count one, David the king. And when you go further to the end of 14, you end up where they were carried away to Babylon. So that would fit in with the verse 17, which says from David until the carrying away into Babylon is 14. So what we're dealing with is this question here is at verse 2, Abraham begat Isaac. This person contended you have to include Abraham in the count, so you would get 14. And I'm going to show you why that's incorrect. And this may not interest every one of you, but if you may get the same pushback, and you need to know how to answer it. And so I'm going to show you how it is. So there's no question about the third set is wrong. It's 13. It's clearly 13. And even the Christian scholars have mentioned that. But virtually nobody has ever mentioned that the first set is also wrong. So I thought to myself, well, I better be sure I'm counting this correctly. And I'm going to prove to you that it's absolutely a fact. It's 13 generations here. I mean, you can see it here on the page, one, Abraham, the generation from Abraham to Isaac is only one generation because there's only one child. We'll see that's the simple meaning of generation. The cycle of birth is just the generation of Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob. That's one generation, not two, because Jacob is the child, and so on and so forth. It really isn't complicated, but you need to see how this was argued and how I analyzed it, and hopefully that will help us in using critical thinking and how to make analysis of a problem like this, because this is for a lot of people, this is life and death. For me, what this proves is whoever, I'm not saying the genealogy is necessarily wrong, although it could have been tampered as well, but what verse falls if there's 13 generations in that first set? Well, it's this verse that falls. Then this verse is not by the Apostle Matthew. Okay, that's the point. Somebody tampered with the genealogies and is adding things to it. Could have added more. Could have added the virgin birth, for example. Could have added names, which is what I think they were doing. They were adding Jeconias to destroy the messiahship of Jesus. So by taking and adding Jeconias, who was cursed in Jeremiah 23:23, Jesus can't be a Messiah, even if Joseph were his father. See, so that's something that doesn't make sense. Why that would be put in there? And there's no need to do that. There's multiple ways around him to get to the Davidic heirship that Jesus needs to be the Messiah under the prophecy of the prophet Samuel. Okay, so let's just go through the breakdown of Matthew 1, verse 17. This is the one I'm claiming is the clearly false, uninspired passage. Okay, so we don't know of the other passages. Are they inspired or not inspired? We could assume they're inspired, but this verse is uninspired. Whoever decided to add these generation totals can't be Matthew because he can't count. And they can't be inspired because the numbers are wrong, and that's really the bottom line. He should know how to count because he's a tax collector, and he should know the number of generations by some inspired help of God. So we have verse 17. All the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. That's false. There's 13. We'll see. And from David, well, we've already seen all these things, but I'm going to review that a little bit. And from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. 14 is correct. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. That's false. It was 13. And the scholars have pointed that out. The Christian scholars even have to admit that's false. It's 13. All right. So, and then people just live with these things. But what we're trying to do is find out, if this is false, why is it false? See, so I believe in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit on Matthew for everything in this Bible, other than those things that are demonstrably false. They can't be from Matthew. Somebody added them in, and we are going to see there's a reason did that. All right. So, and how I found this is I was just wandering around one day in the internet, and I found the sermons of Constantine. I was interested in the Epiphany. I've always been interested in what was that holiday and how that's basically the celebration of Jesus' baptism. And because that's when the Epiphany of God happens from heaven, that's called Epiphany. And so I was always curious about it, but I wandered around and I saw this, and it's a book from 1952, published by Newman Press, obviously Catholic. And so, and then I ran around and I looked around. I found the passage on the number of generations that begins at page 37, and he's counting them out. And he's going to say that the heretics are claiming there's only 41, not 42 generations. So they had obviously found the one in the third set, but no one seems to notice the first set. So that means I triple check that. So when somebody challenged me on it, I had to think, well, why are they challenging me? And we'll see why they're challenging me. And I will only concede that nobody has seen this before, but it doesn't mean it's not true. I can count. Anybody can count. Anybody at all can count. The question is, how do you count? Do you count Abraham in there as a generation apart from the generation of his child? No, you don't. But we'll see. And so so at one point he actually counts out the generations to make just simply to say what they are, and he's not even saying whether this is a correct number. He's not totaling this one. He just assumes the first set is correct. So he says the family lineage of Jesus is this. So this is Augustine in around 380 AD saying these are the generations. So I went through here and I numbered each one. Abraham begot Isaac. That's one generation, one child. Isaac begot Jacob, two children. Jacob begot Judas, three children. Okay, and I just want to show you, just because Jacob appeared in the prior verse, Isaac begot Jacob, you don't count Jacob separately when he's the parent of Judas. You just count Judas as the child that's of note. And 4, and Judas begot Phares and Zara of Samar. 5, Phares begot Esrom. 6, Esrom begot, so on. And you go all the way to the end, and you only have 13. Okay, so just keep following it. And when I did it the other way, where I counted it out and I put in the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, same thing. It comes out to 13 every time. So that's not the question. That's not what this person's claiming. They're not claiming I missed something. They're claiming you count Abraham. Okay. So here's what he wrote me, and I'm going to read you much of it, not all of it, but you can screen capture as I go through it if you want to read it in detail. He says, a 1-hour video and you miscounted. For your viewers, I've written it all down so they can follow along as you fail to count Abraham and Isaac as two people, two generations, not one, and instead you count their generation GAP. I'm not sure what he means by that. I think he's saying you should count their generation gap. Okay, and then after that, he goes into a totally separate issue, which is on the third set, which he's contending that he says, then later you failed to acknowledge the evidence of a mistranslation in the Greek based on the Aramaic text that Mary's father also had the name Joseph, which makes Mary generation 13 and 14. I don't know what he means by I failed to acknowledge evidence. I mean, nobody's presented me this evidence, and there is no evidence in any commentary about what he's talking about. And I mean, the commentaries have as much interest to provide this information if he's correct. And he's claiming the evidence for this is in the Raiders of the Lost Book video series. So I'll look into that and I'll report back if there's anything to tell you guys about there. And then he kind of repeats himself here. He says, you count Abraham and Isaac as one generation. They are two people. Yes, they are two people, but they're only one generation, my friend. You can't just count the generation GAP instead. I'm not sure what he's saying. I think he's saying, I'm just looking at the gap between Abraham and Isaac. Well, you're going to see that's true for everybody. There's a father and a son. That's always one generation. And you don't count the father in the generation. You count just the sons. That is what is the meaning of generation. So we'll see that it's the problem he has here. And then he's going to give us again the list of the people. So 1 to David now becomes 14 if you count Abraham, which you shouldn't count Abraham. Then he shows us 1 is Salmon, but notice he doesn't count David, Solomon's dad. So he's inconsistent. And that's what I'm going to show you later. This is where he falls down, because he should count David. It says, and David begat Solomon. So why doesn't he count David? See, that's not consistent. And that's how you can disprove what he's saying. He doesn't himself follow it. And then the third set is as follows. And then he's claiming the third set gets modified, as I told you before, by virtue of adding another person named Joseph, the father of Mary. This is supposedly in an Aramaic text, and that would cure the problem. And I'm all in favor of Aramaic. If you can cure any of these things, I'm all in favor of that. So I'm going to look into it. But if it's not valid, I've never heard it from anybody. It's just you can't make up this stuff. It has to have some textual basis. We'll see. Okay, so here was my first reply. You say, quote, you count Abraham and Isaac as one generation. They are two people. You can't just count the generation gap instead. Yes, and my response is yes, they are two people, but in a lineage, they are not both being counted as born. Abraham is the starting point of the generation he produced, Isaac. The word generation means a birth, i.e., a person generated or procreated. Okay, so then I cite for him an article that actually is someone who's trying to defend the number of generations, and he's dealing with the issue. This other article at Got Questions, which is usually generally good authority for things, and they're trying to defend that even if it's alleged to have only 41 generations, they're going to try to contend there's 42. Okay. But they agree the structure of the genealogy descends from father to son, beginning with Abraham. So a genealogy of descent is the generation is father to son. You don't count the father's generation, you count the son's generation. So you only have one generation when you count from father to son. That's the structure of the genealogy depends upon that. And they agree with that. I think anybody else would too. Hence a generation. So I write this. Hence a generation is a father and a son. Without a father, there is no generation. A father and son are not counted as two generations because we are counting births to number the generations. Hence Abraham to Isaac is one generation, one birth. When this is used in set 2 of 14, we do not count David 2 times. It comes out mathematically correct as 14 generations. So if you just say, David gave birth to Salmon, you don't count David in that as a generation, right? I'm talking to you, the audience. And if you did, you'd have 15 generations. So it can't be what he's saying. That's what I'm trying to say there. And hence that supports one must read Abraham to Isaac as one generation and not two generations, just as David is not counted in. Okay, so I concluded, do you see now the flaws assuming generation includes the generator instead of only the generations, i.e. the children listed? So we're not supposed to count Abraham, who is a father and not himself generated or born in the list, as not one to be numbered in the generations. Makes sense now. Blessings, Doug. Okay, to which he replied, now not counting Abraham in this passage as one of the 14 generations is a ridiculous interpretation. So he didn't try to refute me at all. I thought to myself, I could just go and leave him alone and leave him in his mistake. But what I maybe need to do is give him one more version of the argument where to make it clear that if you're correct, the second set would have to count David as who is only described as a father in the second set. David begot Solomon. Following his logic, you would have to count him twice, and then I show him that you would end up with 15 generations in the second set. So if he were correct, that we would count Abraham as a father, as a single generation, even though his only role in the first set is to be a parent. If we count him there, then we have to count David in the second set. So even if you end up if you could redefine generations to be that you would include the parent in that first line, Abraham, if you count him, then you have to count David in the first line of the second set. And now you would have 15 generations in the second set, while you corrected the first set as 14 sets. Now, I'm not advocating that, but I just want to show you one way of trying to convince somebody to say, even if we assume what you're saying is true, it would only remove the error from set 1 and it would create the error in set 2. That's kind of what I'm going to say. So I hope this comes through. And again, if you were in my position and someone's arguing with you and saying you shouldn't count Abraham, you should count Abraham in set 1, you say, well, what first of all, generations doesn't mean the father's count is a separate generation. It's the father and son as one generation, obviously. Okay. And then, but if you even want to say that it includes the father, then your problem is looking at set 2. Now that would be off by 1. So it's a transfer of the problem. So anyway, so I wrote him back and I said, Jason, thank you for writing again. However, you are incorrect. I will explain more again, but possibly more clearly. Remember Matthew 1, verse 17. The proof is all in there. 17a. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And B, from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And C, from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. So I say, here goes the proof. Does subpart A, from Abraham to David in 1 verse 17, mean to count Abraham in the number of generations as you claim or not? One way to know is to see whether counting from David until the carrying away to Babylon, that's subpart B, the same language as in 117a, counts David among the 14 generations that fit into that time span. Fair? Of course it is. That's a fair thing. If it's true for set 1, now it has to be true for set 2. Now, from David carrying away to Babylon, 14 generations per Matthew 1, verse 17b, clearly does not include counting David as a son of his father. You yourself and even the author of the Matthean genealogy counts from David to mean from David as father to his son, one generation, as the first generation. So, as I showed you earlier, he counts the first generation as what? If you go back to his list, he does not count David in that, does he? Here it is. He counts Solomon as generation 1. He doesn't count David, even though it says David begat Solomon, just as it said Abraham begat Isaac. He doesn't count it. So I'm pointing out the inconsistency with his arguments. This is what we call special pleading. It's a fallacy. If one thing is true for your argument, then it has to be true in the same identical circumstances elsewhere. So you can't have it one way when it suits you and reject it when it doesn't suit you. Okay, let me just stop it there. All right, so we'll pick up from where we were before. When counted from, hold on, I'm going to close something. Okay, when counted from David's role as father, excluding counting David as one born, and one counts from David's son, that was Solomon, as the first generation, then you have a total of 14 generations from David to the carrying away into Babylon in Matthew 1, verse 11. So, and so let's just go back and see that real quickly. So if you are here, where are we? Oh, let's go back. So if we are looking at David's generation, see we're in the middle here where it says 1 in big yellow, all caps. So you have David, the king, begat Solomon. So you count this as one generation because you're only counting Solomon. You don't count David. Just like when you're up here with Abraham begat Isaac, you only count one generation. That's Isaac. You don't count Abraham. Same principle. You follow the same principle in both. And we showed you that he himself, in his own list, shows Solomon as first generation. He doesn't count David. So he's not consistently following the principle he wants me to use for the first set. And he's only wanting me to use it because that will help avoid this alleged, this real problem that we have with set 1. So, okay, so hold on. We're going to come back over here. If you, on the other hand, counted from David to mean you count David, one already born, just as you're insisting to count the generation from Abraham to supposedly include Abraham, one already born, in that number of generations, you would get 15 generations in set 2. So in other words, if you count David, besides Solomon, Solomon's father gets counted 2 as well. Now you have 15 generations in set 2. So you would end up creating set 2 being wrong, even though it's correct. It has 14 generations when you use the proper definition of generations. He doesn't see that, so I'm trying to convince him by showing him this alternative argument, which is if you are consistent, you would have to read David begat Solomon the same way, where you would count David the father as part of a separate and additional generation, which brings you to 15, and you would have that problem. If that reading were correct, then you could fix the Abraham set number 1, meaning you get it to be count out to 14, which is his goal. But now the only set that previously could be accepted as correct at 14 generations is just set 2. The second set now is 1 over. It would be 15. So you can't say the principle he wants to advocate for set 1 is true, because if you do, you have to apply it to set 2, and then set 2 is off by one number. So one way or the other, it's going to be set 1 or set 2 will be wrong. You still end up with a mistake, but not in set 1. You have transferred the error to set number 2 by using your means of counting generations to fix set number 1 to necessarily have to apply to set number 2. Okay, so hopefully by this point he realizes he's wrong no matter which way he goes. If he tries to stick with his original view, it's only going to cause set number 2 to be false. So reevaluate your first view of set 1 and realize you don't count Abraham there. He's not part of another generation. From Abraham to Isaac is one generation, not 2. That's his flaw. So here's the way I put it to him. Where does the error truly belong? In set 1 or set 2? It is in set 1 because generation means offspring, not one father, the patriarch, plus the offspring. This is simply by using definitions. Hence, set 2 is correct at 14, and this dictates that set 1 is off by 1, 13 instead of 14, as you do not count the role of Abraham as patriarch or the father when counting the generations to David, any more than you count David's role as patriarch in the 14 generations that follow himself. So whoever wrote Matthew 1, verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, could not be inspired, nor could he or she be Matthew, for this person did not know how to count and was mathematically wrong. Matthew was a tax collector and above all knew how to count. So it's not Matthew who wrote that, Matthew 1:17. So that's what we've proven. And so that leads to a lot of other possibilities here. Hence, you are not supposed to count Abraham, the individual, as a generation because he is not identified as born in the counting. Rather, from means from when Abraham was a father, how many generations or births followed until the carrying away to Babylon. By the count in set 1, it is clearly 13. Hence, whoever wrote this genealogy was certainly not inspired, and hence was not Apostle Matthew, but a fraudster, which is true. Somebody put in a verse that Matthew did not write. For the 2 reasons I've said, an inspired person wouldn't make this mistake. Moreover, Matthew was a tax collector. He knows how to count, and he would have been off in both set 1, which is only 13 generations, and he would have been off in set 3, which also is only 13. So he got the middle set correct. So he got one of the sets correct. So he knows how to count, in theory, enough to get that one right, but he got the other 2 wrong. Seems really incongruous that a tax collector who counts money would count these generations incorrectly. Okay, so that's it. I think that's the bottom line. So I think this is the end of this episode, but I hope this will help my friend Jason to realize that what I'm saying, sometimes when you hear someone say things, have you ever noticed that you can say things maybe easier for someone to understand your points? When it's on a piece of paper, it may be just too hard to follow. And I tried and I rewrote this a couple of times to make sure it would be simple and clear. And so the bottom line for all of us is that we now know for a fact someone other than Matthew wrote Matthew 1:17. That's a fact. The question now is we must ask ourselves the more deep question is what explains the final generation that doesn't have, that doesn't have Jesus, where it says in the current version, it says, Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who was called Christ, of whom was born Jesus, who was called Christ. So this just doesn't mention Joseph as being a father of Jesus at all. And as a result of that, Jesus cannot be the Davidic heir because he has no lineage connection whatsoever with David. Okay? And but this person believes there could be an Aramaic text that has Mary somewhere in the middle of this lineage. But we'll have to see. It's very clear when you read the original, even the original Greek, it's the lineage of Joseph, and it's the lineage of Joseph also in Luke. Okay, yeah, I'm going to interrupt the ending. I was going to bring it to an ending, but I'm going to stop right there because I decided to take a look at that Mr. Rude series. And Mr. Rude, I like him. I've seen him before. He's very passionate. He's great about exposing Constantine, and I love his guest Nehemiah Gordon. So I've always enjoyed his episodes. But now I'm trying to dig in deep and to understand what he's teaching here. And he actually has the same concept as our friend here who's writing. If I remember, his name is Justin. Anyway, so he has it. Aram is his own level. This is at page 47 of his book called The Chronological Gospels. It's actually free online, so that's great. Michael John Rood, 2013. And but if you notice here, there's a difference. Remember I told you that the second set is to the right in this list here. So that begins with King David at the bottom, and you count up Shlomo, which is Solomon, and all the way up, and you get 14 generations, but you don't count David there. And so even though it's from David, remember the words are from Abraham to David are 14, and from David till carrying away to Babylon are 14. So you don't count David in the from David to Babylon. You don't count him. You skip him because he's the father. He's not a son. So that you have 14 generations of sons. So it's correct. But over here, could Mr. Rood not have realized Yavram is being mentioned just the same way David was mentioned over here in the second set? He's just the father. He's just the father over here. His son is Isaac or Yitzhak. So to me, this is a slightly disingenuous thing to actually represent to people. This is no problem at all. This is this is 13 generations, so you still have a problem. The problem is, or the reason why this is not brought up by Mr. Rudin, I'm going to be frank. What I think it is no one's ever mentioned this before. No one. I think this is one of those things where everybody who sees it just says, "No, don't bring it up." No, you have to bring it up because if there's something missing, then there's something wrong there. That tells us something about it. This whole this verse is not by Matthew, and that's the key here. Because all the torture we're going to see, he's going to go through. He's going to try to find a solution, and Nehemiah Gordon's going to help him go to look at the Peshitta. But even when you go there, you see it's a very convoluted kind of argument that you now have to go through thinking the scribes use a term meaning one thing when it could mean another thing, and that could be making in the lineage of Matthew is really the lineage of Mary having another father. Her father's now suddenly mentioned in the lineage of Joseph. But Nehemiah Gordon is saying, well, he thinks that's the meaning of a word in the Aramaic, and he can read and speak Aramaic, so theoretically he has some weight to it. But if you really look at the logic, it doesn't make any sense. But I'll go into that in a separate episode. But my point is that this is not correct. The way this is presented is not. You can just see here. Abram has no son next to him. You can see there's only 13 generations of sons. Abram is just a father, just like David is only a father over here, and David wasn't counted over here on the right. He shouldn't be. Abraham should not be counted on the left. Okay, so we'll come back and we're going to examine this, and we'll try to determine if there's any plausibility to Mary, being in the actual lineage on the side of Matthew's lineage. Is she supposed to be in that lineage? So this is what Nehemiah Gordon is supporting to believe, and that's premised on just one little fact, which is a word description could be either talking about Mary's husband or Mary's grandfather, but you have to then also presuppose that Mary is in the lineage of on the Matthew side, even though she's not named. So you have to believe there's a mistake where she should have been mentioned as a son of one of the people in the lineage instead of Joseph. Okay, so this is the bizarreness we're in. So now we're supposed to believe it isn't aimed at Joseph; it's aimed at her, and then she can become the generation. Then when Jesus is generated from Mary, that becomes the 14th generation. You see, so yeah, so you have to imagine there's a huge blunder, and that they made a mistake between Joseph and Mary. Like you could see the two words and not go, oh well, I should say this is the parent of Jesus is Mary. If that's what it said, why didn't the scribe write it down? He didn't do that. So we're supposed to believe he made a big blunder. But my position is this: is that all presupposes a mistake happened, right? But why would you completely get rid of the word Mary, and particularly when Jesus doesn't end up having any Davidic lineage, and you are writing this, and the whole point is that he has to have a Davidic lineage. You can't leave it where there's no transmission to him of a Davidic lineage. So nobody in their right mind would write this without putting in either Joseph or Mary at some point. That's really the bottom line. I mean, sure, somebody's left out. The person probably left out is Joseph, But if you claim it was Mary, that would have been an easy choice. Just put her down. And now we have 13 generations and Jesus makes 14. You see? So that's what's the problem. We've got to have Joseph or Mary as a parent named in the lineage, and Mary isn't mentioned. Joseph is, but he doesn't beget Jesus, and so it doesn't become the 14th generation. There is no 14th generation. So that's we're going to have a problem there. Well, I as I foresee it, but I'm going to give a fair look at it, and we'll take a look at it. And Jason, I hope you'll be continue to read and study, and you if I'm mistaking anything, you're going to correct me. So I'll share it with you, Jason, and we'll keep having a dialogue, I hope. And that's it for tonight. God bless everybody. I hope this helps. Ciao.